All right, it's December 23rd, 2013, and this is Arizona Mining Review. I'm your host, Lee Allison, here at the Arizona Geological Survey in Tucson, and joining me for the first time live in our studio is Nyal Niemuth, who heads up our economic geology section from Phoenix. Welcome down to Tucson, Nyal.
Well, it's great to be here, Lee. Instead of just saying that, I'm actually here.
Yeah, usually it's Skyping between us, so this is great. So what we normally do is get a recap of what's new, what's been happening since our last show in November. So what's new and exciting? And I know there's a few things.
Well, contrary to the last couple of months, we've actually got some good things to report, some good news. The last couple of months, we've unfortunately been dwelling on some of the negative impacts that have been hitting the state, hitting some of the projects pretty hard. Mm-hmm. Some of those good news stories will be, we've found someone, a company called Geo, who's going to help out Mercator Minerals at their Mineral Park mine. That's our porphyry copper operation up in the northwestern part of the state. They've been struggling financially. They're going to see if this deal goes through. It's proposed to close in the second quarter of 2014, an immediate infusion of $14 million capital. And in the long term for this project and other company projects, they'll see $100 million.
So is Geo buying Mercator or just investing, or do we know at this point?
It's an interesting proposal. Basically, Geo is going to acquire 85%. The existing shareholders or Mercator will have 15% of this new company. Geo, I think it's going to be called MMC. Okay. Kind of an interesting story behind who they are. A Russian whose name is Mikhail Prokhorov has had prior mining experience in Russia and the U.S. through a company called Neuralist. They've mined platinum group metals here in the Stillwater complex in Montana in previous years. So one of his holding companies, 1XM, is going to be the ultimate source of this financing that's going to come in and create this new company, which will largely be owned by the new Geo.
Okay, so some deep pockets there.
Deep pockets. And they've got exciting, they're not just, planning to be here short term and leave. They'd like to turn the project around, get it to be operating on a positive cash flow. Doing a couple of things, increasing the capacity of grinding through the mill, relocating some infrastructure so they can get to some softer ore, and as part of that they'll also get to some material that's leachable because it'll also help increase the production through the SXCW plant.
Wow. So otherwise Mercator was looking pretty...
Mercator was on the ropes.
Yeah.
They were operating week to week with the approval of the lenders.
Okay. So this is definitely good news for that.
Good news for Arizona and for the Mineral Park operation.
Wow. Okay. We're going to be watching that one to see where this new company goes. It sounds like once they get here, they may be looking for some other opportunities in the state.
I hope so.
Yeah. Okay. So there's some other news here in Tucson area.
Yeah. I think a lot of people were surprised by the news. How about you? How did people in Tucson respond?
The mining industry has been very, very upbeat, very positive in the sense of after 6 years, this whole Rosemont permitting process has come to this point. So the people have been just hunkered down and kind of grinding through this, and every time they thought they were getting close to a decision by the Forest Service, it seemed to be postponed. So to actually see the final EIS come out and the record of decision coming out, I think it's sent a real positive course through the mining industry, but there's still some roadblocks ahead, some barriers to get past before the mine could actually start development.
Exactly. We haven't seen much reporting on this in Phoenix. It's not been quite as important to our community as down here. But just so everyone knows what we're talking about, last week we saw the final EIS be released. On a week ago, Monday I think it was, we saw the draft record of decision be released. The significant point there was the Forest Service's approving of the project. Now we look at the next 4 months. There's a 45-day period where the objectors get to file. There's a 45-day period where the Forest Service gets to review and look at those issues. And then there's a potential for an additional 30 days. So that's a 4-month review process that we'll enter now.
Right, and for those of you who probably are going, what are you talking about? This is the Rosemont copper mine in the Santa Rita Mountains, about 20 miles south of Tucson, that's been mired in some just terrible fights and battles between forces that are concerned about groundwater issues and biological preservation, scenic preservation, and then this huge economic driver. So that you've really divided the community down here over this and along a number of different lines, and it's just been going on for years now. So there's still some issues with getting a 404 permit from the
Army Corps of Engineers.
Corps of Engineers, getting past some EPA concerns and questions that they've raised. So there's a number of issues, but I think overall the company feels that those are all achievable. From the messages that Rob Pace from Rosemont was circulating to people who've been following this, they seem very upbeat and feel that they can address the issues now that they have the Forest Service, EIS, and the record of decision. They can work through and solve these. So they're feeling pretty optimistic that early 2014 they may be able to start moving some dirt and start construction.
We'll see if Augusta's able to hit those timelines.
Yeah, they've been optimistic many times in the past.
Well, they've had a lot of staying power, so I'm sure
Yes.
they're delighted to be at this stage.
Yeah, right. So, anything else going on in Arizona in the last few weeks that really catches your attention?
Yeah, there's one other bit of good news. You know, earlier this year we saw one of our gold projects suffer some setbacks, but we've had some good news on phase one from Northern Vertex and Patriot Gold's Moss project. Phase one was kind of a pilot metallurgical demonstration. They mined 90,000 metric tons of material. They put it on a heap leach pad.
Okay.
Did a little finer grind they were initially expecting to do, minus quarter inch. But they're starting to recover some of that gold from carbon also by measuring the fluids, get a sense of what the recovery is going to be. In a relatively short period, shorter than they were expecting, they're already seeing about 65% recovery of gold.
Oh, that's higher than they were expecting or projecting, isn't it?
A little bit.
Okay.
And they haven't said much about the silver, but maybe there's some good silver recovery too.
Okay.
But either way, that's they're currently casting that as a positive result. So that bodes well for phase two, and then the more difficult, because it will involve additional permitting, phase three. Let's hope those metal prices hold up.
That's one of the big challenges, and I think that takes us into the next piece that I wanted to discuss with you is that we're wrapping up 2013 here, and this will be our last show of the year. Let's take a little retrospective. What were the big issues in Arizona, or the big developments, the big news activities in Arizona in mining and mineral resources in 2013? And we know that there was a huge shift in commodity prices this year. So that's one of them. And what does that mean? What has that meant for the industry in Arizona? Moss Mine is one, but there's been others.
Yeah, if we were to pull back, just so we have this in the permanent files, we're seeing much softer copper prices. We saw a 50% decline in the, a 30% decline in the price of gold, from $1,800 down to about $1,200. Those have had negative impacts directly on our operations. We've also, sometimes we forget what a global world we live in. We've seen companies who have had capital outlay projects outside of Arizona be forced to gather some assets by sales here in the state. A good example of that would be, if we look back, we saw the sale by BHP Billiton of the Pinto Valley mine,
Okay.
and recently we saw the first production results released by Capstone, the acquirer of that project. So that was a major change in ownership of one of our large porphyry copper operations.
Right.
Sadly, back to those gold prices, we saw after a 9-month run this month, the closure of American Bonanza's Copperstone underground gold mine out in the western part of the state. So that's why it's kind of nice to see these early positive results from on the moss leaching.
And one of the other areas is potash, which we don't have any potash mining yet in Arizona, but there's been a fairly aggressive exploration program ongoing by 3 companies. But the breakup of the Russian-Belarus cartel earlier this year just threw the entire global potash market into disarray, and prices of companies dropped 30%, stocks dropped 30%. Nobody was quite sure what was going on. Investors pulled back, waiting to see how things played out, and there's still no certainty about how this is going to play out. So a lot of mines worldwide are on hold while companies reassess their investment, or investors reassess what they're going to do, and I think in Arizona as well. So the 2 companies that have been most active recently, American West and Passport, have been finishing up some of their exploration programs. Their stock prices are down, and the sense is everyone's waiting to kind of see how the global market plays out, and investors are holding back as well. So I think all of these companies are just kind of on hold right now while the global market kind of sorts out.
We discussed early in the year that a lot of the junior companies might disappear. They certainly, with the market trends, are not able to raise capital. The potash companies are certainly suffering from that later. Earlier it was hitting, I think, the metal companies harder. So this severe drop in potash prices, we're at about $300 a ton now.
Right.
Certainly isn't going to help them in the intermediate term.
Right, and I think the $300 a ton price is something a lot of companies were looking at as kind of the pivot point. You know, if it got below that, would it justify the capital costs of developing some of these new, especially deeper mines or those in more remote areas or away from infrastructure? I think Arizona fares well in terms of being right adjacent to the infrastructure, highways, railroads, communities, and a climate that allows year-round operations at the surface, and they don't have to shut down some of the winter operations like some places do, in a pretty shallow reserve. So that the prices for a new mine in Arizona are about a third less than what we were saying for a new mine, say up in Saskatchewan. So that bodes well. But even with that, the whole global market, I think, is just everyone's on hold, waiting to see how the pieces play out.
Yeah, I concur. Having those infrastructure advantages in place, those won't go away.
Right.
But we need to see some recovery before we'll see anyone be willing to step up and make large 800 million, $1.5 billion type capital investments to start up a new project.
Right. And
There's certainly at present we're seeing cutbacks. We talked about earlier the Potash Corp layoffs. So there's excess supply right now. We're going to need to see that
Yeah.
price and demand increase.
So one of the world's biggest suppliers of potash cut back their workforce globally something like 18%, if I remember the
Yeah, that
numbers I've
included
seen.
some phosphate operations, but also
Oh,
was
okay.
largely hitting their potash operations. Yeah, so
Okay. So, what are the big things we ought to be looking for in 2014?
well, we'd like to see stronger gold prices, and again, just looking at some of the articles that are coming out near year's end from the analysts, I don't think we should get our hopes up for that. There are a lot of people forecasting we'll see another $100 and maybe $30, $40 drop in the price of gold. The good news is, late here in the year, we're certainly seeing a firming in demand for copper and some slight increase in copper prices. We've been trading recently in the 330 a pound range.
Okay. Now, the Rosemont story is one that's still unfolding, and it's going to be early 2014 before we see if all the permits are approved and whether they can actually get started. And whether there's lawsuits or not, that I don't know if those could delay something, or that might just be, those will be ongoing if the company does get their permits and can start operations. So that's one that, particularly in southern Arizona, everyone's going to be watching.
In the central part of the state, maybe we've got something encouraging breaking on the federal level. We are seeing some more reasonable compromises being made by the Congress to pass a budget. Maybe we can get hopeful that we'll see some movement on the Resolution Copper Land Exchange.
Right. So that would be the largest copper mine in the U.S., I think, if 7,500 feet underground. Huge investment, but they need that land exchange to make it happen, and it's been held up in Congress for a few years now.
You know, it's going to take a long time to develop that project, so
Right.
even if we get the land exchange, we'll start seeing some additional jobs as development proceeds, additional shaft sinking, et cetera. But it'll be a long time before we get to being having that largest copper mine be Resolution
Yes.
instead of Morenci.
Right, okay. The other things that we might look for in Arizona, we see the new money coming into Mercator Minerals, so that keep their doors open, and perhaps some new development going on there.
We've also been seeing the long-term enthusiasm show up in the finishing of some minor improvements. Recently, Missions had their dedication of their new mill. They've also modernized, that's for the copper mill, they've also modernized the molybdenum circuit. We've got the expansion proceeding in the mill up at Morenci. There are other, we talked about Mercator. One thing I forgot to mention, they also look at bringing in a fleet of 200-ton trucks, replacing the 100-ton trucks.
Wow.
And so it'd be nice to see across our mine operations some of those continued investments.
So we're seeing the guys already working here expanding their operations, and I think in this past year we've seen a lot more news stories about companies moving into Arizona, arriving in Arizona who haven't been here before, or coming back after they've left saying, well, the grass may be greener somewhere else. And my sense is we have, what, 3 front page stories in Northern Miner, you know, talking about the great opportunities in Arizona. my own conversations with some of the bigger companies in the state are that they've moved overseas in previous years, but they are now coming back. They're seeing the value here in Arizona that may have been overlooked. So there's a sense that there's a renewed optimism and sense of opportunity in Arizona that maybe we haven't seen in past years. So that even with commodity prices down, people are taking the long term and saying there's potential here in Arizona that we need to come back and re-examine.
I agree. I think that'll be bolstered by the progress that we've made at Rosemont in terms of the permitting. I think people will be encouraged to see how, relatively speaking, quickly and easily we were able to get the moss to production stage. Just recovered maybe 350 ounces to date, with more carbon to be processed from what they've already leached. Those will be positive signals, readily received and widely appreciated by the others in exploration and mining. And we've seen those companies believe in those properties. That's one of their assets they've held on to. So even though they're hurting financially, they've got that good Arizona geology that they're going to keep exploring.
Yes, that's right. Okay. Joining us now is Dave Maher, Vice President of Target Generation at Bronco Creek Exploration here in Tucson. Welcome to the show, Dave.
Thanks, Lee.
And what is Target Generation and how does that fit in with the Bronco Creek philosophy?
Well, Bronco Creek has got a prospect generator business model, and the idea behind that is instead of going out and funding exploration as many junior companies do, our business model is to find targets through good geologic research and field work and take those targets out to partnerships. And with those partnerships, the partnership funds the exploration going forward, and Bronco Creek would retain a piece of that, whatever was found, a royalty.
Okay, so that's a title of Target Generation that I've never heard before used in the industry.
So what we do is we generate targets on the front end.
Okay.
And then we would advance it at the early stage, and then the partner would advance it to discovery.
Okay. Now, what I understand, what I know about Bronco Creek is your model is different than anybody else I've seen in terms of kind of putting together a geologic reconstruction of the region and looking for those places where there should be a deposit that people have missed for the last 100, 150 years.
Yep. And that's something a little bit different that we bring to the table, where the last big exploration push that took place in this part of the world was in the 70s. And subsequently, there have been a number of companies come and go that have done exploration here, with a few like Asarco and Freeport that have been sustained for some time. But what you've seen is not much exploration that's taken place. And to put that in perspective, that's around the time that plate tectonics theory was being developed.
Okay.
So it's been a long time. We have a much different understanding of the geology of Arizona. And what we've been able to do is, from a system scale approach, come back into districts and look at regions, think about things like the tilting and the faulting and the structure in the context of the system scale of mineral deposits, and use that as a tool for finding new prospects.
Okay. Now, I've seen some of your company presentations, and you've gone back and reconstructed the tectonic and structural history of Arizona, and I suspect you're doing that across other areas around the West. How far back in the geologic record have you been able to reconstruct things?
That's a great question. It depends on where you're at. As you know, there are areas in Arizona that have been fairly highly compressed in the past as well. But what we have to do is we have to start at the most recent time and work our way backwards. And what we do is we use the tertiary rocks as a way to facilitate that. So we look at what's happened to the younger rocks, and we work backwards through that to see what the older rocks look like at that time. And as you go further and further back, it obviously gets more complex and harder to figure out. But the idea is, if you look at what's happened to the post-mineral rocks in this part of the world, or what post-laramide rocks, that tells you what happened to the rocks since the laramide, which is when most of the deposits here were in place, the copper deposits we're looking for. So.
Okay. Now, you've got a pretty good portfolio of prospects that you've been generating in Arizona. This looks like your base, but I've seen some in Nevada and Utah and a few scattered around.
Yeah, we've worked a lot in different places in the West, but this is sort of our backyard and we know it well, so there's a lot of opportunity here. And we have a great geologic data set to work with, as you know, that between the USGS mapping and the AZGS mapping that you guys have been doing, there's a great geologic database. That is like the first step tool that we use, is looking at the maps and using that to figure out, how to put faults back together. And the reason it's important to do these reconstructions and think about this is when you're looking for a porphyry system, in a way it's like a needle in a haystack. It's hard to find one of these things. They're not very big from the standpoint of volume in the crust. And so when you're trying to work back through the reconstructions, it's really important to figure out as best you can where the faults are and how much they've moved. And if you don't have a good understanding of the scale of the movement on the faults and things like that, you're going to miss the target. So.
Okay, and these are targets generally that are not visible at the surface.
Yeah.
Where people would have walked over this for the last 100 years and never had any idea.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Things, the way we look at it is most of the easy stuff's been found. You're rarely going to walk over mineralized rock in Arizona that hasn't been significantly tested. But there are lots of places where there are mineralized areas in Arizona that we have recognized are portions of a porphyry system, okay? And then they've been fault bound and displaced typically undercover somewhere. And if you do good geologic homework, if you will, and work back through that, you can find where these things might project to if you understand the scale of the faulting and scale of the systems.
Okay. This sounds so logical, so reasonable. Why hasn't anybody else done this before?
People have thought about this stuff in the past. Certainly, some of the geologists were sort of the understanding, especially as the mapping was sort of taking place in the 70s, is people were starting to recognize that this was occurring, but they didn't understand the things like the scales involved. And again, remember, this was so long ago that people didn't understand extension, much less, plate tectonics at that point. And people were recognizing that the rocks had to be tilted a little bit, but they didn't have all the scales and things down. And definitely, the understanding of porphyry systems with Lowell and Gilbert and the porphyry copper model and subsequent understanding of tectonics has evolved through time, but most of that had taken place after many companies in exploration had left Arizona and started working in places like the Southern Cordillera.
Okay.
And so people hadn't really come back and done a systematic application of that around here, and there's a lot of opportunity in our own backyard.
And we're seeing that just in the last year. I think we've seen articles in things like the Northern Miner and others where companies are coming back. The big guys who were here and left seem to be coming back, and a lot of other companies are coming back here. So let me put you on the spot. How much copper, say, is undiscovered in Arizona compared to what we've already found?
That's a great question. One way to look at that is if you look at a map of Arizona and you look at where laramide systems, batholiths, intrusive rocks, extrusive rocks, and porphyry systems lay in Arizona, and the bulk of these are showing up in exposed bedrock panels, okay?
Okay.
If you look at the areas around there, there's no reason to think that there couldn't be as much or more copper underneath these covered areas. And the covered areas and the areas we're looking in constitute 60 or 70% of the ground, so you could just, if you want to look at it from that standpoint, there's a lot of opportunity. The trick is, how do you figure out where to go?
Right. And that's where you guys seem to really have put the finger on a good exploration technique. Now, in looking at the company profile, you see a lot of PhDs in geology. I think the company makeup of the expertise you bring is also different from most exploration companies.
Yep. We have a full in-house staff. We do everything from permitting and land work and so forth in-house. But the focus is on the geology, and that's where we bring something to the table that we feel we bring a competitive advantage to the industry. You look at a lot of other companies that have come and gone, and there have been a lot of there's been a lot of turnover in the industry. And what we've tried to do is get some of the best people we can get and bring them in and have them think about the geology and the opportunities there, and that's what we think we bring to the table that is refreshing.
Okay. Can you give me an idea of what projects are furthest along in Arizona?
Within Bronco Creek.
Yes.
As you know, exploration is risky, right? And so with our business model, what we attempt to do is build a pipeline, build a portfolio of projects, and get them advanced under a number of partners. We've got 23 projects in Bronco Creek. I think there are 15 in Arizona that we have active right now. I believe 11 of those are in partnership and advancing. And the idea is that we get a lot of these projects tested, and they're all early stage. We don't have anything nearing production, for example. But the idea is we generate our portfolio organically. It's all grassroots, okay? Basically, we don't go out and we're not acquiring, we're not buying into
Right,
companies
okay.
and things like that. So we're generating everything organically, so it's all at the front end of exploration. The idea is if you create a pipeline of projects, okay, obviously with exploration, a number of these are gonna fall off the table along the way, but if you generate a number of good targets, some of them are gonna make it to production at some point, so
Okay.
that's the idea. And that's where you see the most value generated in exploration, is at the front end.
Okay. Now, it seems like most of your prospects are copper, but I'm seeing gold and silver and moly and
Yep.
what else in the portfolio?
That's primarily it. We've mostly focused on gold and copper. We have looked into other opportunities. We anything is on the table for us in that regard. But we tend to focus on where we think we can add the most value and what we know best. So,
Okay. What should we be looking for coming out of Bronco Creek over the next couple of years?
we have a number of new projects that we had generated in the last couple of years that are now under new partnership and advancing. So we're going to see a lot more drilling and ideally these projects advancing toward discovery.
Okay. Now, I know the prices of a lot of commodities have pulled back here recently, but with you guys being in this for the long haul and being relatively early in it, has the reduction in prices for gold, copper, silver had any real impact on your operations at this point?
Yes, actually, it varies quite a bit. You know, we've gone through a number of cycles since Bronco Creek really started developing, and the bad news is that it sometimes affects us negatively in the sense that we partner with variety companies, junior exploration companies, major companies, and so forth. And when the price goes up and down, it affects them, so that ultimately affects us. However, from the standpoint of our business and our business model, this business model is designed to sustain us through these various cycles. And so from that standpoint, when things are going up and down, we just keep going.
Okay.
So.
All right. Dave, this is really exciting. I've been watching the company for a few years here and fascinated by the geologic understanding you guys have brought to the table already. I think it's causing a lot of us in the geoscience field in general to rethink how much we know and realize how much we don't know about the tectonics and the history of Arizona. So it's exciting to see what you're doing. So, well, thanks for coming in, and best of luck
Thank you.
with all your prospects.
Thanks a lot.
All right. Well, with that, I think we're going to wrap up this episode and this year of our first year online with the Arizona Mining Review. Thanks for tuning in. And our producer-director is Mike Conway, tech support from Ron Palmer, our set design, Arnie Bermudez and Stephanie Maher, our media intern, Jenna Favo, and on camera, Jordan Matty. Thanks for tuning in, and Happy New Year to everyone.